Do you call yourself an anti-Zionist?
No, I don't. Um, and it's interesting because I think these positions are always evolving, and I think these things are very complicated. I think there's a conversation that really needs to be had, a national conversation about what is Zionism, how would you define it? Because when you speak to different people, there's always lots of different versions of it. For me, the baselines are quite simple: that you cannot have anyone living in a place where they are occupied, where they're oppressed, where they do not have equal rights. Now, I think there's a legitimate conversation about what is the ideology, or how do you create something that both protects Israel's right to exist and Palestine's right to exist, and what is the name of that? And I think that that is not up for politicians in the UK to decide. So I'm avoidant of that term, because I'm avoidant of any term actually that seeks to categorize what should happen in that space beyond my values and what I should say should be everyone's values, which is equal rights. Now, if that sounds like word salad, I guess as I'm saying it, I'm like, that's a very complicated statement. Let me put it another way. Palestinians and Israelis should decide what happens for the future of that region. It should not be for the Israelis, who clearly hold the power in this situation, to decide unilaterally, and that's where third-party countries were vital in that, in being able to hold that space and hold those negotiations and hold that conversation. And how you do that in a war-torn country with decades of occupation and oppression is an incredibly complicated question, but that's why we need much greater moral leadership and courage than has ever experienced in order to how to do this. Just to be clear in the answer to your question, I don't categorize myself as a Zionist either. It's just that I don't wake up in the morning and my number one kind of mission isn't, how do I bring down Israel? That's not what I'm trying to do here. My number one mission, amongst all the other things I'm trying to do in politics, is how do we bring equal rights, peace, and egalitarianism to people living side by side. And I heard, I can't remember who it was to credit it, but I heard recently a commentator, a journalist, say, we'll really know when we've got there when there is an Israeli embassy in Palestine and a Palestinian embassy in Israel, and it's no longer a problem because actually they are two neighbors that live side by side. Will they be best friends? Probably not. I don't imagine so. But I also think you don't need to be best friends to be neighbors. You just need to be able to live in peace and be able to have diplomatic relations with each other. And that's the place I'd like to see us get to. How we get there, I've just been talking about truth and honesty. I don't have an easy answer for that.
Right.
But I don't think it's for politicians in other countries to come up with the answers. I think it's for us to hold a space where there can be a conversation about that. We are, with Palestinians and Israelis, we are so far from that space at the moment because people are being oppressed and occupied, and there is nowhere near equal terms. So I'm often criticized, including by my own Jewish community, that in some ways I'm being one-sided about this. I don't think I'm being one-sided about this. I want peace for Israelis too. But when you look at that situation right now, there is such a disproportionality in power, and we are not selling arms to Hamas, or at least not anymore. We are selling arms to Israel. And so I think as a British politician, my responsibility and my power and influence, limited as it is, has to be aimed at
Our ally. We call him the ally.
yes,
right?
exactly that. And it's when Rishi Sunak stood next to Netanyahu and said, we hope you win. No one's winning there. Death and destruction is winning there. We've got to get out of this winning and losing.
Can you just speak to that, what you just spoke about, which was being a Jewish person and the criticism you get from inside of your community? And I know that because I mentioned Zionist because you will hear a lot of the time, obviously you don't have to be Jewish to be a Zionist, but I'll hear a lot of the time 90-80%, whatever it is, of Jewish people are Zionists. So to be anti-Zionist is to like this stuff. And I think, how have you navigated being Jewish and your voicing your concerns around Palestine?
Yeah, I want to caveat the whole answer with Palestinians have been going through a genocide that is unimaginable. And so I'm going to talk about my pain in a second, but I want to caveat it with,
Of course.
the Palestinian voices need to be centered here. You're asking me a question about me, so I'm going to, enough about me. I'll answer about me, but I just wanted to put that out there. It's been incredibly difficult, and it's been painful because to have what should be considered your family, I'm talking about the much wider community, to be the people who have your back, to love you, to feel like you are part of that community, even when you disagree, is part of what family is. But I have received, of all the most vociferous criticism, insults, and frankly threats that I've received in my career as a politician, the vast majority have come from within the Jewish community. And as I'm saying that out loud, that's wild. That's so painful. There have been a huge amount of Jewish people who have supported me, who have amplified my voice, and I've amplified theirs, and I've been incredibly grateful for that. Particularly want to shout out Namod, who are a group of Jews who are speaking out against the occupation. And to come to your last question, I've always struggled with the question around Zionism because I grew up in what was essentially a Zionist community. And so when I increasingly felt uncomfortable about that, I also felt increasingly uncomfortable with the idea that I was anti-Zionist because when you look at the kind of history of Zionism, it was to combat or challenge oppression and the Holocaust and to find a safe space for people. It was a fundamentally left-wing and socialist idea that over time has been being distorted as an understatement. And so it's just been a complicated question about words that evolve, and I just didn't have an answer to it because I was like, I'm not a Zionist, I'm not an anti-Zionist. And it was Namod that were really helpful in going, you don't need to be either. You can just say clearly that you're not pro this and you're not anti this, you're for peace and human rights. And so that's been really helpful to have so many people in the Jewish community. I really challenge this idea that there is, well, let me start. I'm massively challenged with no doubt the idea that the majority of Jewish people in this country support Netanyahu's government. We just pretty much know that's not true. We know the vast majority of people in this country are very unhappy about the genocide that we're seeing, even if they don't call it a genocide. They're unhappy about seeing the mass killing of innocent civilians. And that's, by the way, why the police response has been so fierce and so top down, because the government know they are complicit. The main opposition know that they are complicit. And so there is a conspiracy between the two of them. And I don't mean this as a conspiracy theory. I think it's quite clear that there is a plan between the two of them where they agree not to disagree about this, because ultimately the number one thing they need to do is to stop the organizing of communities and the majority in this country who are now so far away from where mainstream politics are that is a fracture through the entire establishment of our country. This is not just on Palestine. I would say it's almost very much on the climate crisis, on the issue of workers' rights, on the issue of inequality in our society. We're seeing this increasing distance between a state who need to use the police as the essentially violent force often of the state, not always violent, but particularly for Black and brown communities, to oppress the challenge to their authority.
Yeah.
We're seeing that.
Can you talk about that actually? Because obviously we've just seen, at the time of recording this interview, you've just seen the past weekend these marches that were like heavily policed. They tried to ban them. You're seeing more kind of attacks on the freedom of expression and freedom of speech, essentially, of people who support Palestine, and then you're getting that state violence involved as well. Can you just talk about like that experience, what's happening right now with these marches?
Yeah, I mean, it's horrendous. I think, first of all, the whole discourse around it is a tactic in itself. So I think it's created suppression. When I speak to people who would normally be at those marches, particularly talking about older people, although I acknowledge that there's lots of older people who are the fiercest warriors of all. I mean, warriors in a peaceful way who are still on those marches. But there's lots of people, like I spoke to someone yesterday whose parents would normally be at them, and I said, "Oh, your parents coming today?" And they said, "No, they just didn't want to be kettled, for hours." And I get that. So, first of all, I think the suppression is a tactic in itself of changing the routes, saying you can't do this, you can't do that. The whole discourse has been around the disruption of a synagogue. The synagogue was never on the route. It was never proposed to be on the route. I, as a Jewish person, would never, literally never advocate for disrupting a synagogue. It's just something I would not do. And also, even if the argument was that the BBC, which was the target, was near the synagogue, I think it was half a mile away, the plan was to get to the BBC at like 4 p.m. and the synagogue service finished around 1:30. So we're not even talking about the close time. So that's been the first problematic kind of conversation. The second has been arriving at that protest. It's been my experience, but certainly lots of other people too. The aggression from the police even arriving at the protest. This was an entirely peaceful protest where people like myself, Jeremy Corbyn, John McDonnell, Juliet Stevenson, the actor, lots of cultural leaders, people from community groups. How distorted does your worldview have to be to look at someone like Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell, who pretty mild-mannered people, and kind of claim they are enemies of state that are somehow forcing through police. That's incredibly problematic. I've just written a letter to Yvette Cooper today, the Home Secretary, to ultimately call out that the police have lied. And that is, I was about to
Won't be
say,
the first time.
well, that's what I was about to say. It's a new development in terms of lied on such an institutional scale where the Home Secretary is saying this. But obviously, there are lots of stories through the past, whether it's the Hillsborough disaster, but also, again, lots of Black and brown communities, their daily experience with the police. But I mean this much more institutionalized, organized, where the Home Secretary is out there pointing at MPs, pointing at an assembly member, pointing at these civil rights groups and saying, these people are lying. They've forced their way through the police. I immediately countered that on social media when I didn't realize there was going to be video evidence. It's now been very helpful that since I've countered it, the video evidence has now been produced that absolutely demonstrates that what myself and the MPs and the people at that march are saying is true. And actually, the story that's come out from the Metropolitan Police and the Home Secretary is a lie. That is so corrosive to justice. That is so corrosive to a Metropolitan Police Service that is already badly mistrusted. A police service that was found to be institutionally misogynistic, homophobic, and racist. Now, as I say all of this, I worry. Obviously, I worry. It's deeply damaging, but all of this is playing into Farage's hands. This all plays into his idea of two-tier policing, and you can't trust this and you can't trust that. And this is the problem here, is Keir Starmer is rolling out the red carpet to these narratives because he's making these narratives true by eroding trust in grassroots communities. Again, it is our responsibility to both challenge the narrative because you can't just let it lie, but also at the same time point out why Farage's solutions here are not the solutions. And ultimately what we need is a return to basic principles and a return to amplifying grassroots voices and those voices that we should be caring about. And, why are we hearing from Elon Musk and I was going to say Nigel Farage and all of those voices? Why are we not hearing from grassroots leaders, community leaders? Why are we not hearing from the people who are out there daily doing the work and really making a change in their society? And we just don't see or hear from those stories.
Right.
And that's so problematic. But the last thing I just wanted to say, it comes back to 2 questions ago. Is around the Jewish community, that for all my negativity towards some of the establishment that have rallied around the idea of weaponizing our Jewishness and weaponizing anti-Semitism, there are so many other Jewish people who are in a long tradition and history of left-wing socialist Jews who are saying we stand with our brothers and sisters in Palestine, we stand with oppressed people all around the world. And I'm just so proud of those people doing that work because they are putting their head above the parapet. The establishment will do everything they can to cancel them, to create mistrust around their narratives, to challenge the things they say or do. And I think all of us, every citizen in this country, needs to stay focused and not get distracted.
Yeah, I'm very glad you said about the weaponization. And I think that's important to remember because I am very much a believer of having compassion for people, and essentially the Jewish community is being gaslit a lot of the time and weaponized and used as political football by people who have no interest in their well-being.